talked with someone that started a conversation off with, or you husbands came home, or you wives came home and you said to your spouse, I got good news and I got bad news. What do you want to hear first? And generally speaking, depending on who the individual is, you want to hear the bad news first. Just give me the bad news, let's get this over with, and then give me the good news. That's me, that's certainly me. In fact, I was listening to a pastor, and he was sharing a very interesting statistic that he said that 90% of all news is generally bad news. Which for a lot of us, that makes perfect sense, especially as you read the headlines. It's not surprising. Interestingly enough, though, he also said that from Industry Week, it's a monthly trade publication, they also had something to share about this subject. I'm going to quote it directly. It won't be on the screen, but listen to this. Bad news is more likely to attract a casual reader's eye than good news. It's a secret journalists have known for years that bad news gets more attention than good news, meaning more people are likely to read a story if the headlines imply something rotten rather than something wonderful. And again, most of us are hearing that and are like, that makes perfect sense. It's no surprise that people gravitate towards bad news. As much as we don't want to admit we hate hearing it, it's the truth. And yet, we're living in a time where bad news or certain words are avoided, especially in church, like the S word. I'm not talking about the potty mouth S word. I'm talking about the S-I-N S word. Don't say sin in church, John. It's offensive. Just avoid. If you want the church to be happy, just avoid that word altogether. But here's also another reality check, ladies and gentlemen. How can anyone know the good news without first hearing the bad news? And the gospel really introduces something redemptive in that. But that's also the purpose of the law. So a lot of us, we're going through these verses in Exodus and we're trying to find out how this applies to us. But really, the law in a nutshell is intended to reveal the sin. We've established that the law can't save us. It never was meant to save us. Only Jesus can do that. Only Jesus can be the perfect redemptive solution to this problem called sin. But we don't dismiss the law either. Paul the Apostle said in Romans 3:20, therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. Even Paul recognized that he's not going to ditch the law because the law itself revealed who he was apart from Christ. And that's really what's going to happen as we're studying these laws that a lot of us are like, this doesn't apply to me today. But it still applies to the greater issue, and that's that we have a sin nature. Not only do we have a sin nature, it's a problem internally. When I was in middle school, I used to walk to school and walk home. And I remember on my walk back from home, I would take a different route because I remember there was this apple tree and the branch would go over the fence. And I would often take apples from it because my friend told me, legally you're not stealing from him if it's over the property line. And I'm like, you sure know a lot about this kind of stuff. And he was probably a felon now. But anyways, I would take an apple every single day, and it was so crisp, it was so amazing. And I remember this one particular day, I took a bite into that apple, and there was a ginormous worm in it, which my friend was like, it's protein. No, he didn't say that, but I did. Guys, I spat it out. I never did it again until I forgot, and I did it again. But interestingly enough, a lot of us assume that worm often gets inside of the apple from the outside in. But scientists have told us that oftentimes it's an inside job. They tell us that sometimes these worms and these other things lay eggs inside and they blossom while the tree is growing, and it's in the core of the apple. I know some of you are you're never going to look at apples again. Within the core, the worm grows inside of the apple and bursts from the inside out. But it's kind of the same when you think about humanity. It's always been an issue internally. It's always been an internal core issue. That's why the Bible says it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles them, it's what comes out. It's been a problem for each of us that as much as we want to admit, we try to fight it, but we're born into it. We're sinners by nature, and then we're sinners by choice. So because of that, that is why the law is established. The law sets the standards to point us to the solution, which has always been Jesus Christ. Now listen, everyone, whether you've heard this in church or not before, I'm going to say it. The law of Moses modifies behavior, and that's it. That's all it is. It's a behavioral modifier. It cannot fix the issue of character. Parents in the room, when you go on dates and you would leave your kids at home and you wondered if you were making a good choice or not, parents, you would tell your children, be on your best what? Behavior. You better be on your best behavior. And although maybe some of your kids were that, the real issue is that parents, you set the law. If you don't, this is what's going to happen, right? And maybe the parental law, the household law, it doesn't fix the issue with some of our kids that they're going to obey you, yes, because they love you, but primarily you're going to realize, especially with every kid, they have a sin nature. Yes, they want to honor you. Yes, they love you, but really it comes down to that core, which is why in the same way that the law of Moses, it's a behavioral modifier, but Jesus has to be the solution, which is why here in chapter 22, much like what we learned last week, we're going to see different particularities of the law that we wonder, why was it established and how does it apply to me today? So let's begin the very first one. Verse 1, Exodus 22. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. I want to give you guys a little comparison in the cultural norms at that time versus what God was implementing here in Exodus chapter 22. There used to be this ancient legal code that predated Moses, about 1700 BC, a Babylonian code, versus the law of Moses was around, give or take, 1300 BC. But they discovered this Babylonian code that was established by a ruler over 40 years, and they did some archaeological discovery that detailed these laws of this ancient culture, which as you looked at it were very similar to what we're reading in the law of Moses today. And so because of that, Moses and this Babylonian law are often compared. But when the Babylonian law speaks about thieves, as you look at some of this archaeological evidence, their law demanded that if a thief was caught and could not repay or fix the problem that they stole, they were put to death. The law of Moses, however, even though some see it as harsh, some look at the Old Testament, it's harsh, it's rules, it's nothing but that. It's, if anything, from a cultural standpoint, it was a more merciful code of ethics, if you will, that many of the people were not familiar with because of this Babylonian code that was established in the law. And maybe some of you are looking at me like, well, why are you bringing this up? Because have you ever heard someone say or make a comment, well, the Old Testament reveals a God of wrath, and I'm more of a New Testament kind of a guy or gal, a God of mercy and grace. Have you heard someone say something like that? I certainly have. But the reality is that I think that the Old Testament, especially as we understand the context and the cultural point of view, that he still is a God of love. He's unchanging. His character doesn't change in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because as I'm reading through this, we're going to see God was seeking to protect the innocent and challenge the guilty, but in a less harsh way than the code and the cultural norm that they were used to. You're going to see throughout this passage of Scripture that we serve a God of restitution. He actually wants to restore you. He's aware of the things that are going on in your life, and he's aware of the things going on in your marriage and your interpersonal relationships and work relationships and issues maybe with your kids. Like, he's aware of it. And here's the beauty of the cross is that it restores us back to a relationship with Jesus. And the law was intended to promote restitution over revenge and getting what people deserve. And so for the Jews, they're familiar. They're not, like Moses just gave the 10 commandments, thou shalt not kill. So as Moses is giving more specifics, if a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he's got to restore the 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. So in this particular example, if I stole your lamb or your ox to either steal and sell it or eat it myself, then I am responsible, according to this law, to restore the ox 5-fold and the sheep or the lamb 4-fold. Now, some of you might be like, yeah, like whatever, but this is starting to get expensive. Now, in America, we're told if someone steals or if a thief is caught, typically he's sued or he's required to restore whatever it is that he stole. But in the Old Testament law, you restore what is stolen plus compensation. And some of you might say, well, that sounds like some American law. Well, it depends on who your lawyer is. But anyways, I think if each of us had this law established and I knew I had to pay 4 or 5 times what was taken because of that property damage, like a lot of criminals would probably be a little more careful. Maybe not, I don't know. But here's what it's a far contrast when you consider the time when this was written, when these laws were established, that at least, and again, I'm not getting on my soapbox, but I am just for a second. It seems back then that they were more interested in taking care of the innocent party. But some things happen in our rendering of judgments that seem unfair, that seem off, maybe some of you might say. It seems like today that people are more interested in the rights of the criminal, that we're no longer interested in the rights of the person who's been victimized by the crime. And don't get me wrong, guys, I firmly believe that we're innocent until proven guilty. I'm not up here like John's an anarchist pastor now. Like, I'm not saying that. Like, law needs to be established. I even recognize that a jury of my peers could render judgment on me concerning false testimony against me, and I can get something that I don't deserve. But I also recognize that a jury of my peers could very well see that I'm guilty of whatever it is, and that I should get whatever is due to me because of the crime I committed. The judicial system is helpful, but it's not perfect. So what's the solution? Not to sound like a broken record, but here it is. It's got to be Jesus in every aspect, in every way possible. That our hope can't be in a governmental system, judicial system, political party, pastor, leader. It has to be Jesus. He's the solution for everything. And with this law that's being established to the Israelites, when it came to theft, you better be careful because this is what's going to happen if you do it. But now it gets more specific. Verse 2, if a thief is found breaking in, a more literal translation is digging through. I'll get to that in a moment. He is struck so that he dies. There shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. So back in the day, as most of you are probably aware, that many of their houses were built from clay. When we lived in New Mexico in the mid to late 80s to early 90s, I remember there was a lot of stucco homes. I remember there was a lot of the old homes made from clay. A lot of them are beautiful and actually amazing. But here in Exodus 22, a thief doesn't necessarily just break in, he digs through in order to enter the house through the sidewall or the roof. And the idea is that he's breaking and entering, or as I stated, he's more specifically, he's digging through is the more literal translation. And if he is caught digging through, according to this law, you can kill him, and it's not considered murder because it's assumed by the assailant digging through your house, he wants to harm, steal, or provoke any kind of ill will towards you or your family. So again, to protect your family, this law is established. Hey, you should be able to protect your family. Hey, you should be able to protect your stuff if it's at night. This can be put into play. And a lot of you are familiar with the fun Colorado law, Make My Day. Someone wants to invoke harm on your home, you are legally justified to do what is necessary to protect yourself and your family if someone enters your home to cause any kind of harm. And by the way, before I forget to mention it, God does also give rights to criminals, but he doesn't override those rights because of the victims either. So enters your house, he digs through, you can stop him, verse 3, but here's a stipulation to it. This is where it gets interesting. But if the sun has risen on him, meaning if it happens during the day, there shall be guilt for his bloodshed. He, meaning the thief, should make full restitution. And if he has nothing, then he shall be sold. Like we learned last week, it's a voluntary service to pay his debt. Then he shall be sold for his theft. So especially between verses 2 and 3, there's a difference between breaking into someone's home at night, and interestingly enough, and Moses has to establish it, there's a difference between someone breaking into your house during the day. At night, there's no visibility. You kill him at night, it makes sense. You don't know what's in his hand. He might kill you. And because it's harder for you, the victim, to find help because everyone's sleeping, well, then you protect yourself. You kill him, and it's not considered murder. But interestingly enough, verse 3, if it's during the day and you kill the man breaking into your house and you have this complete visibility, you may be able to see what's in his hand, maybe not. Moses is kind of sharing there's a fine line now. It was considered, like if you kill him during the day, it could be over the line of revenge. It could be exacting too much. And in a lot of cases, if it's during the day, like he could be guilty. But look at verse 4. But if the thief is certainly found alive in his hand, meaning maybe the animal he's stealing or whatever, whether it's an ox or a donkey or sheep, he shall restore double. So again, differentiating a thief who steals to sell it, to eat it himself, versus a thief who has the animal and it's basically restored back to the guy. Okay, you gave me back my sheep, but guess what? According to this law, you actually owe me an extra one. You owe me double, or sometimes even more, depending on the size of it. If it is the first case and he kills it or sells it 5 times, he gets caught with it, he restores it back to the owner, it's only 1 time. Moving on, verse 5. And if a man causes a field or a vineyard to be grazed and lets loose his animal and feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. Okay, so back then, ladies and gentlemen, before the city had, all of the blueprints of your house and how much acreage you own, whether it's like 3/4 of an acre or an acre or half an acre or whatever. Back in the day, they would mark their homes by stones. They would use some form of markers that would indicate who the owner of that property was. But the problem is, animals can't read signs that say, this is my property, don't eat. Even the stone in front of them, they're going to disregard. So again, here's an animal. He can't read a sign unless it's a dolphin, of course, because they can read and speak Latin. That's not true. But anyways, animals can't read signs. So the animal looks at the stone and he's like, I got to graze. I'm hungry. He goes over it, and he very well could be eating his neighbor's freshly yummy grass. And so if he does that, you're essentially allowing your animal to steal from your neighbors, which Moses, as I'm imagining he's penning this, and he's hearing the issues of the land, and he's communing with God, and he's writing all this stuff down. a lot of the people are like, good. And it's funny, too, how we treat the law like that. Some of us agree with some law that's established. Some of us are like, this is the dumbest law ever. And I get it. But again, the point of this, again, was to point out the behavioral issue of sin. In this case, you could be a dishonest neighbor and just let him eat in your neighbor's grass because he's eating all the grass in your own. But look at verse 6. If fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that stacked grain, standing grain, or the field is consumed, he who kindled the fire shall surely make restitution. During the dry season in Israel, especially summertime, if you're out cooking bread, because they would often do it on top of a stone, and they would do this again, if they did this during the dry season, sometimes the temperatures, even in the summer mornings, they were cold. So they would both make bread and warm up. But the problem is, if you're not careful and it gets out of hand, that fire could spread. And according to this law, the person who started the fire has to make restitution. Now, ladies and gentlemen, after reading that, I can't even begin to tell you how thankful I am for homeowners insurance. Because otherwise, Carolyn's and my house fire, like, I can just imagine the firefighters come and they're like, well, you got to make restitution and fix all of this issues. I would panic. In fact, it's kind of sad because a lot of us are aware of a lot of homes that homeowners are dealing with that, like in Boulder. Did you know after the fire, I increased my homeowner's insurance because at the time, lumber was so outrageous that if my entire house burnt down, my insurance wouldn't have covered it. And a lot of people in Boulder, they're dealing with that right now. It's an interesting thing that when and by the way, the fire was completely my fault. And I'm so thankful that we all got out safe and no one was hurt or killed. But I'm looking at this law, and it makes sense because they didn't have insurance policies back then. It wasn't like, well, I was cooking next to my sheep, and the sheep kicked, ash, and it spread. It's like, no, dude, you started the fire, you got to take care of it. He who kindled the fire shall surely make restitution. But then it continues. Let's read verses 7 through 11. If a man delivers to his neighbor money or articles to keep, and it is stolen out of the man's house, if the thief is found, he shall pay double. A lot of us are thinking, why is this person holding money and articles of clothing? It gets better. If the thief is not found, the master of the house shall be brought to the judges to see whether he has put his hand into his neighbor's goods. So it's like, we're trying to determine whether or not, you had a hand in this, or if you're lying or not. And for any kind of trespass, verse 9, whether it concerns an ox, a donkey, sheep, clothing, or any kind of lost thing which another claims to be his, this cause of both parties shall come before the judges, and whomever the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. Verse 10 and 11, and if man delivers his neighbor a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any animal to keep, and it dies, it's hurt or it's driven away, no one seeing it, then an oath of the Lord shall be between both of them, that he has not put his hand into his neighbor's goods, and the owner of it shall accept that, and he shall not make it good. Now, this is interesting because a lot of us are looking at this like, this doesn't apply to me. I would never go to my neighbor and be like, hey, can you watch my sheep and my ox, my articles of clothing, and whatever money I have? But this was a common practice, and it was a common issue. And there was a common issue that, oh, hey, your stuff was stolen, or hey, your stuff got away. And so the judges were the ones that would oversee and determine this. Now, let's apply this to modern day terms. Let's say someone came up to you and they were like, hey, I'm moving, but I need you to store my restored DeLorean from the Back to the Future movie at your house. And you're sitting there and you're like, I love 80s cinema. Of course I'm going to hold your DeLorean in my garage while you're doing whatever it is you're doing. And then all of a sudden, that DeLorean goes missing. It was stolen. Maybe it was the friend holding it, maybe it wasn't. You very well could be holding that car somewhere until this passes over and then you'll sell it. I don't know, but your story is, I didn't take it. This is so weird. But you, the friend who lent your car, you're like, no. You know, I don't know, Freddie over here, he's got he's got shifty eyes. I don't trust. I'm taking this guy to court, right? And so Freddie's before court, and then all of a sudden he comes before. I solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. Interesting. Now God's brought into this picture. So if this person is willingly, now let's apply it back to Israeli time, the Israelites in Exodus 22, and they're making this oath. I promise in front of God that I am telling the truth. And he, in fact, is lying and is a lying rat. And he's swearing to God by it to invoke the name of God and is still lying. What do you do? Look at verses 12 and 13. But if, in fact, it is stolen from him, he shall make restitution, there's that word again, to the owner. And if it's torn into pieces by a beast, then he shall bring it as evidence, and he shall not make good what was torn. Now, again, this is interesting because especially during this Babylonian overlap, they're not used to that. This guy needs to get killed. But what we're seeing is the heart of God wanting to restore, not allow the criminal to get away with what he's doing. And what's interesting about, especially verses 12 and 13, though the owner of the animal suffered loss, he was not allowed to compensate the loss by accusing winning damages against the innocent party. He can't ask for more than what was taken, and he can't bleed the person to death. And again, a lot of us are familiar with the judicial system, and we see that. You invoke harm on someone, which again, it's interesting. I was reading this California case where this assailant broke into a man's home, and the owner attacked him to protect his home, and he didn't die, but he sued him in court. And the man that was protecting his home was sued for so much money, he had to foreclose and sell everything in order to accommodate the victim, the assailant victim. It's like, wow, right? It's human nature. We want more than what we deserve, and we want to make sure they get every penny squeezed from them because of what they did. And really what this law is doing right here is no, you're going to be compensated, but not unfairly. And I do want to point out that there's a parallel idea that's found in the New Testament concerning this text. Paul the Apostle talked about this, that, hey, guys, if at all possible, avoid taking legal matters, you the Christian, with another Christian to court. Alas, that doesn't always happen. And alas, sometimes it's often done in a detrimental way because the enemy is so cunning to convict us, to convince us that the person who harmed us needs to get worse than what they deserve. And really what the church established, especially in the New Testament, is before you take him to legal court, involve the church, man. Which is an interesting thing, and I want to say this from the pulpit before we move on. A lot of you have been through very tough marriages, and a lot of you have made really hard choices that you've wanted to file for divorce. And circumstantially, it's different for everyone. I encourage the preservation of that marriage if possible, and by doing so, you need to come to the church. I can talk through with it, and a lot of times it takes two parties to make it work. It takes one to break it. And I plead with you, as the pastor of this church, especially in the context of marriage, before you consider divorcing your spouse, come to church. Let's see if God can, by any means necessary, restore your marriage. And maybe it's the same thing that you want to sue another brother or sister or whatever it is, and you need advice. The Bible says there's wisdom in the counsel of the multitude. Walk not in the counsel of the ungodly, the Bible says. So my hope is, especially for the team here, that we help you think through that process. Because really, as you probably are seeing, especially as we're studying, human nature tells me we need to get more than what we deserve, and people need to get the worst squeezed out of them so they know never to mess with me. And that shouldn't be the case. Verse 14 through 15, and if a man borrows anything from his neighbor and it becomes injured or dies, the owner of it not being with it, he shall surely make it good. Verse 15, if its owner was with it, he shall not make it good. If it was hired, it came for its hire. I want to point something out in these verses, and really in all the verses that we've read so far, that 6 times in all of these verses, the term restore or restitution is mentioned. The Hebrew word, listen, is shalom, which in shalom means whole or complete. But some of you are like, that sounds like another Hebrew term. Yeah, shalom, which means peace or health, wholeness, safety, or completeness. It's the same idea, but here's the idea behind shalom. It's more than just saying, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It means doing everything necessary to bring peace, to bring shalom. You have to do something. There has to be an action on your part to prove the change of heart in order to pay back whatever it is that you stole. And for a lot of people, it's not necessarily a physical thing you stole. It's building trust again. It's going to take time. Because whatever the fabric of human relationship is, it's torn by sin. It's torn by this human nature to want to hurt someone. But restitution, restore, shalom, is what sews that back together. And this is what makes the gospel so beautiful, you guys. That each person in here is guilty of sin, and we are by nature unable to be right in the eyes of God. But the cross restores us back to God. We were once afar, but the cross brings us back into a restorative, amazing relationship with God the Father, Jesus himself. Because on our own, we can't do it. We can't do it by being a good person, coming to church. I went to church every week, every Sunday, John. It was amazing. And that is amazing. I gave every week. I served every week. And guys, don't dismiss that. I don't want to dismiss that. The heart of the matter is you do that because of the inward change of what God has done in your life. And then it's enjoyable and not this, I do it because I have to. And according to this law in Exodus 32, you don't get off scot-free because that's going to cheapen the act. There has to be consequences, whether you meant to do it or not. Now, this is interesting. We're going to start some miscellaneous laws, and the first one is against sexual promiscuity. Verse 16, if a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is speaking of premarital sex. Now, everyone knows we're in church. Everyone's like, okay, the pastor's talking about premarital sex. Look at him and don't blink. He'll talk about it really fast. Let's do this. Here we go. Quickly, John, quickly. In the New Testament, it's known as fornication. But interestingly enough, the law here in Exodus 22, it's stipulated if a young guy and a young gal get together, and again, their hormones are raging, and the young man is like, I'm going to seduce this girl to get what I want. He entices her, and they sleep together. According to the law, he has to marry her. Now, some of us are like, thank God that's not the case. But you look back in your past, and you're like, thank God that is not the law. And maybe some of you are in love and you're having a relationship with someone and you want to marry that person. I've met people, I've had premarital counseling with people who justify premarital sex because we're in love and we're going to get married anyway. So what's the point? I'm going to read to you what Paul has to say. Here's the point. 1 Corinthians 7:9. If they cannot exercise self-control, what does Paul say? Let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now, with that said, I want to differentiate the two differences between love and lust, okay? If you're honoring God in the relationship and you recognize you made a mistake and you had premarital relations and you give it to the Lord and you're like, I want to honor the Lord in this relationship because I love this person. I think God's going to honor that, and I think God's going to help you through that process. But if you're that person and you're just lusting and you're like, the solution is the pastor said we got to get married, so we got to do. And then you get married, and then what do you find? You're in this marriage that was driven by lust and not love, and then you're going through so many problems, and you're wondering, what the heck was I thinking? Does that mean you're without hope? No, absolutely not. We serve a redemptive God who can take what maybe you started driven by lust and redirect it in a way that loves your wife the way God intended you to, and to love your husband the way that God intended to. So don't miss that. You're in that relationship right now. God can restore it. We serve a good God. But don't mistake the two. Because in this case, in the context of Exodus 22, the woman that was seduced by the man, that man now has to go to the father and ask permission to get married. For all the protective dads in here. But what if the dad doesn't agree with it? That's a great question. Look at verse 17. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, oh, you guys ready? All the men in the room say amen. He shall pay money according to the bride price of virgins. No, you can't marry her, and you still owe me the money for the dowry that you would have paid if you married her. Seems like a hustle. It kind of sounds like it. But really, the dad had every right to say that. No, you're a scumbag, and you're not going to marry her. And you still have to pay me to compensate for the difference. And it could be in the context where he doesn't utterly refuse, and he's like, yes, I accept this. And as we learned last week, a dowry was established. Verse 18, we transition from sexual sin to sorcery. I know, interesting day in church. Verse 18, you shall not permit a sorceress to live. So sorry, Harry Potter fans. Here we are. Honestly, you know what? I'm really glad this law wasn't established. Especially, I'm glad we didn't live during this time, and let me explain to you why. If this law was established and we were living during this time, my dad would be dead. Some of you might know this part of my dad and his testimony. My dad practiced astral projection, practiced spirit writing. He was a acclaimed warlock, sorcerer, practicer, experimented, and you know who he did this with? Skip Heitzig. They would practice magic together, like real magic. And then God radically saved them. And even to this day, I mean, I'm standing before you right now in January of 2023, and God saved those two guys, and they're both serving the Lord now today. Now you're here, and you get to hear a Bible study because God got a hold of these guys' lives. God's good. But interestingly enough, because I don't want to miss this, did you notice that the text says you shall not permit a sorceress to live? Well, why not a sorcerer? Why a sorceress? Is it just singular if they found a female that only practiced witchcraft, that the sorcerer males were off the hook? Interestingly enough, back then, a lot of males were discriminated against in the profession of witchcraft and sorcery. It was at that time that there were far more women practicing it than men, which is interesting because, again, I've never met someone who's done it except my dad and Skip, who are both male. But interestingly enough, it doesn't revise the issue. If they were still living at that time, they're still going to be killed. Moving on, verse 19. Whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. We're going over everything in church today, guys. Like, this is an interesting day. This is speaking of bestiality, sexual intercourse with an animal. And a lot of us are like, why is this mentioned in Exodus chapter 22? Because the Canaanites practiced it. The Mesopotamians practiced it. They were two cultures that believed by practicing this activity that they were participating with what the gods did, and therefore they became like them, and they were worshiping them in the process, which is an interesting contrast because there's a principle here. And this is a biblical principle. A person becomes like the God he or she worships. David put it this way, Psalm 115, 5-8. They have mouths, but they don't speak. Eyes they have, but they don't see. They have ears, but they don't hear. Noses they have, but they don't smell. They have hands, but they do not handle. Feet they have, but they do not walk. Nor do they mutter through their throat. Those who make them are like them. So is everyone who trusts in them. So this principle, you become like the gods you worship. You worship the God of who's promiscuous, then you're going to be promiscuous. If you're a God that is worshiped that is false, then you're going to be tended to gravitate towards false testimony. But for the Christians, listen, if your uppercase G God is true and righteous and holy, and you worship him, you become true, righteous, and holy, and not because of your own acts, but because of what Jesus has done. You're now set apart because of it. Paul the apostle said it too. Imitate me, Paul said, right? As I imitate Christ. Yeah, I want to be more like Jesus. I want to follow the ways of Jesus, man. I don't want to follow the ways of and being provoked by cultural standards that when I'm mad or when I'm upset or whatever, I want to follow you, Jesus. I want to act like you. So read verse 20 with me. But then he who sacrificed to any god except to the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. Now, guys, I'm going to be very quick on this and we'll move on, but idolatry was a problem with the children of Israel. We learned about it in the Ten Commandments. We learned about this cultural submersion of being surrounded by this polytheistic culture that worshiped multiple different gods. And really what we're seeing here, and this stands out to me that they have to reiterate this, because it's going to be seen all throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, is that God made a covenant with these people, right? And he said, you're not going to have any other gods before me. Like, worship me. Like, we serve a jealous God in that he doesn't want to share worship with false gods. So he who sacrificed to any god except to the Lord, he's going to be destroyed. And this was something that took a long time for the children of Israel to shake off. Verse 21, you shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, this was referring to a resident alien, a non-Jewish person. They weren't forced to become Jewish, but they were protected under Jewish law. In fact, did you guys know, and this is just for the record, that the Palestinians today, within the borders of the state of Israel, they have the same status as what's mentioned in this verse that we just read. They're given protection by the Israeli government. They're given benefits that you wouldn't get if you lived in Gaza and you were isolated in those communities that were trying to destroy Israel. And I mean, Israel still treats the Palestinians like a resident alien, giving them benefits. And maybe some of them aren't happy with that, but they give them benefits that is very similar to as what an Israeli citizen has. To kind of, in a way, give them what they call their own. But look at verse 22. But you shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. Now this speaks for itself. Why is it a good law? Well, because a widow doesn't have a husband now. An orphan doesn't have a father or a human protector. God becomes their protector. And you read this, and then what a privilege it is to take care of widows and orphans. And I know we've had many widows in our church and widowers. And it is a privilege to be a part of something that God has commanded the church to come alongside. Well, what if you choose to disregard it then? What if I don't want to protect widows? What if I don't want to protect orphans? Look at verse 23 and 24. Well, if you afflict them in any way and they cry at all to me, I will surely hear their cry. You think it would just end there? Oh no. My wrath will become hot. I will kill you with the sword. Your wives shall be widows and your children fatherless. Whoa, right? I mean, and it makes sense because of the special vulnerability that both of these parties share. God commanded a special care for them. Don't disregard them. Take care of them. Protect them. Because if you inflict any harm on them, I'm going to hear it. And then you're going to become a widow. And you're going to become a widower. No, thank you. So you know what instead? God, let's honor, protect, and take care of the widows. Verse 25, if you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like the money lender to him. You shall not charge him interest. Guys, in a nutshell, this verse is saying, don't take advantage of the poor and capitalize off of them. Don't look at them and be like, you need money? totally, I'll lend you money. But by the way, for every week you don't pay me back, it's a 39.5% interest rate. And they'll be like, what? I'll be like, it could be 40, but it's 39.5. You're getting a deal. No, that's taking advantage. That's a problem. It's supposed to be according to this, especially with the Israelites exchanging money with one another. It should be an interest-free loan, which, by the way, again, you go to any bank institute, they are not going to do anything like this. It's just not going to happen. But verse 25, what we're seeing, it protected the Jews, especially those who were destitute, poor, to basically get back on their feet, interest-free. In fact, did you know this is still practiced today? This is still practiced today, especially, this was implemented especially after the Second World War II, where we saw this evil decimation of the Jewish people, that a lot were returning back to the homeland. And what was so amazing, especially as they're relocating, they would get an institutional free loan, interest-free, to take care of their families so they can get back on their feet. They could pay off their loan interest-free until they got everything back together. Here's the point. Don't take advantage of the poor. And that's what Moses is implementing. Verses 26 and 27. If you ever take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering. It is his garment for his skin. What will he sleep in? And it will be that when he cries out to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. So again, the outer robe at that time was also a blanket. You make a pledge with someone and they're doing acts of service, loaning money, whatever it might be. According to this, don't hold it. Don't be a money shark. Don't be that guy that's like, where's my money and I'll give it back. No, give it back to him at night. Let him sleep with it. He'll return it back to you. And again, we're looking at this like this is the weirdest law ever. But the idea is that you have Jewish men and women that are taking advantage of others, and don't take their survival needs. Take care of them. Don't penalize the poor. Now, let's fly through the last verses. You shall not, verse 28, revile God nor curse a ruler of your people. Meaning the most basic measure of holiness, believe it or not, is in what we say. God actually cares about what comes out of our mouth, ladies and gentlemen. He cares about what you have to say, which is interesting because Paul quoted this exact same verse in Acts chapter 23 when he was before the high priests. And we won't go through it because we don't have time, but look at verse 29. You shall not delay to offer the first of your ripe produce and your juices. The firstborn of your sons shall give to me. Now, this one's interesting because really what God's establishing is give back to God what is due to him. But I want you to notice the stipulation in verse 29. The verse doesn't give any condition on how big the harvest is. When you make a ton, then you can give back. And if you don't make a ton, then you don't have to give back. There's no stipulation. Just give me your first fruits. And we're told, according to that verse, to not put it off. Your children belong to me. Guys, the Bible says that children are a gift from God. Did you notice that we dedicate kids here in the church? Do you know why we do that? It's not just a religious act. We've done it with all of our girls, and it's not just the firstborn. Like, Lord, help us to raise this child up in the way that's going to honor you. And we dedicate her to you. She belongs to you until the day she's no longer under our care. And so God, he's saying, give back what is due, your first fruits and your firstborn. Last verses and we're done. Likewise, verse 30, you shall do with your oxen and your sheep. It shall be with its mother 7 days. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. And you shall be holy men to me. You shall not eat meat torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. Some of us are like, what? Well, let's say you're just walking along in your neighborhood and you're enjoying the day, and all of a sudden you see this carcass on the side of the road. It's recently been killed. And you're like, oh yeah, free meat. Honey, we're smoking meat tonight. Roger Goodwin. Anyways, that's a big no-no. That's a big no-no. It's going to cost you more than you think. For number one, God says that you're to be holy. meaning there was meats that were intended for ceremonial religious purposes. They weren't to eat the meat. According to the Levitical law, they needed to drain the meat. There needed to be not 1 ounce of blood in it. And they needed to do it immediately upon death. And if you find a carcass that's freshly killed, then don't eat the meat, especially according to the Jewish law. Number 2, the reason why is because that meat, believe it or not, it's spreading disease. Now, contrary to what most of you might think, God's not just doing it for religious holy reasons. He's doing it also to protect the individual to not die from certain meat. So you people that are eating that green meat and you're like, the expiration dates, and it's an option. And that's what it is. Don't do that. Throw it away. Take care of your bodies. Just get fresh meat. And by the way, and I need to say this and move on, our church has a food pantry here that meets on Fridays from 10 to noon. You're low on food at home, use our food pantry that we provide every single week. And I guess here's the point, because I have run out of time, and I want to just add this final thing. In fact, worship team, come up. These laws that we've felt like we've rushed through, we learned some things here and there, and a lot of you might be like, it's going to be hard to retain all this, John. The intention of these laws were to show the issues of who we are. We're sinful. They're moral modifiers. No, they're not even that. They're behavioral modifiers, but that's all they are at best. The only thing that can solve the issue of sin, because we went through every kind of law possible, is not just by keeping them, but pointing to this greater fact that, well, I want to keep them because I love you, Jesus. I want to honor you, Lord. I want to do everything possible that's going to bring you glory. And if there's anything you can walk away with, especially after hearing all the things that we heard, is that God's word is living and active. All of God's word is scripturally given for inspiration, for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, and righteousness. Can we agree on that? Yeah, okay, so God, you've given us your word. So Lord, help me to remember the very things that you want me to hide in my heart for the intention of bringing you praise, not for the intention of feeling self-righteous because I remembered everything the pastor said. We need Jesus. We need him. And the only way that we can do that is to solely surrender.